Welcome back to Research Methods and Statistics paper. Today's module is module 9 and will focus on understanding the purpose, operationalization and measurement of variables, how to do that, because this is a key part of quantitative research. The objectives of today's session are to understand what are variables and the different types of variables, to understand the operationalization and measurement of variables, and to understand the scales of variables measured. As the name suggests, a variable is a quantity or a characteristic of a phenomena that can be measured or classified. It will vary over time and across units. That is why it is called a variable. Okay. Quantitative research focuses on explaining relationships between two or more variables. Variables are characteristics or quantities of a phenomena that you are researching. Okay. These variables are essential aspects of a research. Variables can measure abstract concepts or they can measure characteristics. Variables that measure characteristics, examples are hair color, shoe size, income level, disease status, etc. Variables that measure abstract concepts include things like self-esteem level, well-being, sense of religion, intelligence. So, you have both simple and complex variables as well. Simple variable could be income, where you are just asking them what is their monthly income. A complex variable for socio-economic status could be ownership of house, amount of savings. So, when you have socio-economic status as the phenomena being studied, you can have a simple variable which is income, or you can have complex variables such as ownership status or savings amount. Sometimes you examine only one aspect of an abstract variable. Once again, coming back to socio-economic status, you can just do income, which is one aspect, or you can look at education levels, you can look at savings, you can look at ownership of movable items, you can look at ownership of property. So, these also will tell you more about the socio-economic status of a person. So, this is a complex variable, okay. And you are examining multiple aspects, whereas if you just look at income, you are examining one aspect of the variable. Different researchers studying the same topic may use different variables, which will depend on the focus of their research. They may also use different methods of measuring the same concept. Like we mentioned, socio-economic status, you can use income, you can use property ownership, you can use jewelry ownership, you can use anything to measure socio-economic status depending on the focus of your study. Different studies will have different variables. If you are looking at a study where you are looking at educational levels and you are trying to see whether girls are educated more or boys are educated more, gender becomes an essential variable for your study. If however you are looking at a study where you are looking at married women and their perceptions or their take on something, then all your respondents would be women and all of them would be married. So, gender and marital status would not be variables in this particular study. Variables are extremely important in quantitative research because the main goal of a quantitative research is to examine relationships between two or more variables. A hypothesis tells you does exactly that, connects two or more variables, right? It is a statement that connects two or more variables. So, the importance of variable in a quantitative research cannot be stressed enough. Since variables are so important, it is very essential that you identify the key variables correctly and you start them as soon as you can. So, you have sufficient time to identify the variables. Without identifying your variables, you cannot proceed further. The best way of identifying your variables is to read previous research on topics that are similar to your own. That will give you a very good idea of what variables were used in those studies and what you can possibly use in your project. Why is it important to identify the appropriate variable and how will this help you in your research? That is what we are going to discuss. Variables help provide focus to your study. So, if you pick the wrong variable, your study will go in a direction that you did not want it to go. Second, in order to decide the methods and the tools You need to first make sure that your variable is selected, and then you decide the tools and the methods for measuring these variables. You pick the wrong variable and then you pick the wrong tool, you will end up in a lot of trouble. The findings will end up going in a different direction and you will end up getting confused. Variables can also be used as search items that can help you when you are looking for studies that are similar to your own. So, suppose you want to find out about more information about economic status of married women who are employed in unorganized labor. It's really hard. If you are going to type all of that, you are going to find it hard to look for your studies. So, you could have unorganized labor, economic status, these variables. If variables that you are going to use in your study, you can use them as search terms to help identify researches and studies, especially journal articles, because journal articles have keywords. So, these would show up in your search and would help you identify journal articles and research reports for your reading. Pre-testing the choice of your variables to make sure they provide the expected result is also very helpful. When you are doing your literature review and you are trying to find out your variables, you need to spend time thinking about your variables, analyzing the different types of variables used in different studies that you are reading. So, you are reading the study. When you are reading the study, look out for the variables that they have used. How have they used these variables? What are the tools they have used to measure these variables? And keep thinking about whether any of those would be applicable to your study. Okay. Then you need to examine also how the choice of these variables affected the findings of the study. Think about what they have done and think in terms of if we had changed the variables, would the findings have differed, and then use that thought process back when examining your own variables. Okay. Doing so will help you get a clearer idea on the different variables that you can use, and also help you understand which variables are most appropriate for your study. Doing this kind of analysis of your literature review will help you in two ways. First, it will help you understand the different variables that you can use, and also second, it will help you decide which are the most appropriate variables for you to use. Variables are of two main types. Independent variable is the one that you manipulate in the research, okay, that is the presumed cause, and the dependent variable is the response of the cause or the presumed effect which you are measuring. Okay. For example, a study that looks at causal effects, independent variable is the presumed cause and dependent variable is the presumed effect. So, let us look at a study that looks at a new blood pressure medication. The new medication and the old medication, okay, would be the independent variable, while the difference in blood pressure before and after receiving the new medication would be the dependent variable, right. Now, it is in social work, sometimes it becomes very difficult to pinpoint causes when you are doing social work research, because many factors influence the phenomena in social work research. For example, if you are looking at academic achievement by tribal girls, you would look at what other things can it be influenced by. Teachers' attention, it could be influenced by encouragement given by parents, and it could also be influenced by whether the girl has access to additional tutoring. Okay. So, in social work research, the dependent variable is something that we are trying to find out by altering the independent variable through our intervention. Okay. So, changes in the independent variable predict changes in the dependent variable, rather than say that changes in the dependent variable actually cause changes in the dependent variable. Okay. So, you say here it predicts. Variables can be classified as numeric variables, non-numeric variables, discrete quantitative variables, or others like you can see in the figure. Okay. Numeric variables are variables which have numeric value, weight, age, income. Non-numeric variables do not have number value, for example, gender, which is male or female, ownership of property, which would be yes or no. Okay. Then you have discrete variables or qualitative variables. These have well defined values and take integer values when they are numeric. Discrete variables need not always be numeric, they can be non-numeric. Okay. Household size is a discrete variable. The number of members in a household can only be integers. They can be 5, they can be 8, they can be 6. You can't have 3.5 or 4.5. Okay. Examples of non-numeric discrete variables are things like hair color, gender. You have finite and clearly defined values. You can have only 2 genders, right? You can or 3 in case you want, but you can only have a certain amount of hair options for gender or for hair color. So, these are discrete non-numeric variables. You have continuous or quantitative variables. These can take any numeric value in a given range. Age is a continuous variable because age can be any number in the range 0 to 100 years, for example, can be an integer, can be fractional. So, 15 years, 15.5 years, 15 years, 6 months. Age can take any value. Continuous variables are always numeric in nature. Then you have intervening variables. As the name suggests, these variables come in between or intervene in between the dependent and the independent variable. They help explain the relationship between the independent and dependent variable better. Let us suppose that we are trying to see the effect of high stress levels on marks of a student. Our hypothesis could be the higher the stress levels, the lower the marks. When we are conducting the study, we find out that students do poorly because they are sleeping during the exams. Then we find out that they are sleeping less at night because of stress level. Here level of sleep can be considered to be the intervening variable because the level of stress is affecting the level of sleep. Level of stress is your independent variable. It is affecting the level of sleep, and that in turn is affecting the performance or the low marks of the students. So, it comes in between the independent and dependent variable, and it helps explain the dependent variable better. Now, the last type of variable is what is called an extraneous variable. These are unwanted or undesirable variables which have an impact on the outcome of the study. You must control these so they do not influence the course of the study. These are just opposite that of the intervening variable. Now, we come to measurement of variables. Variables measure simple phenomena, for example, hair color, age, income, or they measure complex phenomena which may require indirect measurement, for example, socio-economic status. You cannot measure it directly, you have to look for indicators that measure it, or academic achievement. Once again, you need to find indicators that will help you measure academic achievement. When a study involves complex phenomena, researchers identify variables that measure one or more dimensions of these complex concepts. You cannot always cover all the complex aspects of a phenomena in one study. So, you identify 1 or 2 aspects that you will focus on and find variables for that, and that is the limit of your research study. For example, a research study involves socio-economic status. One researcher might pick income, another may pick social class because socio-economic. So, you have the social aspect as well. A third example might involve both, where you have both the social status and you have income. Let us take an example of a study that looks at socio-economic status. So, one researcher may look at income, another might look at social class, and a third might look at both. Okay. Socio-economic status can mean more aspects as well. It could refer to education, it could refer to education of the parents. So, there are multiple concepts, multiple indicators that go into socio-economic status, and as a researcher you need to pick on the ones that are most suited to your research, so that your research, the phenomena you are looking at, is explained clearly. So, when we are working with variables, we need to keep 2 things in mind: identification of variables and measurement of variables. Okay. When you are doing this, you need to define the variables. How do you define them? You define them conceptually, where you are explaining what the variable is attempting to capture, and you define it operationally, where you are looking at how you will measure the variable in the context of your study. Okay. We take an example, the same example of socio-economic status to understand this better. Okay. We talk about socioeconomic status, we will be referring to income, educational level, social class, occupational prestige, etc. So, these are all the conceptual definitions of socioeconomic status. In the context of this research, suppose you are only looking at income levels of the sample population. Here, then you say that in this study, the operational definition of socioeconomic status is income. Similarly, if you look at intelligence, there is no direct way to measure intelligence, which relates to capacity of a person to acquire knowledge and use that knowledge to solve problems or reach their goals. So, you need to identify which variable you are going to look at and then explore it further and then operationalize it for your study. In this, you might look at, when you are looking at intelligence, you might look at IQ scores. You might even specify which type of IQ you are looking at, or you might say, okay, academic achievement is only related to the grades of a student. So, you need to be very, very clear about both definitions, conceptual and operational definitions. Conceptual definition is important because it helps you understand all the different complexities, aspects of the concept that you are looking at. So, operational definition is important because it helps you identify your variable correctly. When you identify the variable inaccurately, you will get wrong results. You might not get what you are expecting. Your hypothesis might not work out. Okay? When measuring complex variables, you must remember that the measurement may be incomplete or inaccurate, because you might not be able to find one variable that covers all the aspects of a complex variable completely. So, your best bet would be to select the best variable that you can get and define your concept narrowly, shortly, make it very specific. So, the more specific your operational definition, the easier for you to find your variable to explain this and measure it. If it is not possible to find appropriate variables in the literature, you should conduct pre-tests to make sure that this is working. If you look at studies that you have done that have looked at similar topics, if you look at research studies on similar topics to your own research, you will be able to get a good idea of variables that work and that do not. And if it still does not work, please pre-test to see that the variables that you are measuring are being measured the way you want them to be and that they are appropriate. You could use different measures of a concept to check how the result differs. For example, you use income levels. Instead of using just income level for socio-economic status, you could use education levels, you could add ownership of different assets. So, you would get an overall picture. So, you would have multiple variables and you would get a complete picture through that. When you want to check the accuracy of your operational definition, you do a validity or reliability test and reliability test. Validity refers to the extent to which the measurement process truly measures the variable that you are seeking to measure. So, validity refers to measurement of the variable. Okay? And so, what extent, how truly can we say income levels measure socio-economic status? If you take an example of a land owning family who has both land and animals, okay, their land gives them just enough money to run their family, okay, feed their family. In a year of poor rainfall, they do not have enough to sell in the market, but they have animals that they can sell, they have extra things that they can do. So, they have added assets as against a family which only has land. So, you cannot use income then. So, the income for family A may be lower than the income for family B, but family A has other assets that they can sell to make sure that their ends meet, whereas family B does not have it. So, is income a sufficient way of judging socio-economic status for your study? That is a call you need to take based on what the focus of your study is. This will tell you whether it is valid or not. Okay? Reliability refers to the extent to which repeated measures under the same conditions produce the same or similar results. So, for example, if you are measuring IQ using one particular test, you do it repeatedly, you are going to get the same results. So, then you conclude that IQ level is a reliable method of measuring intelligence. validity and reliability are connected and they are related. For example, a measurement cannot be reliable if it is not valid. So, if the measurement of IQ levels for intelligence shows significant variation in repeated measurements, that is your reliability, then you would question the validity as well. But the reverse is not true. A measurement does not have to be valid to be reliable. Height cannot be considered a valid measure of intelligence because it is not directly connected to intelligence. But you measure the height repeatedly, you are going to get the same height. So, it is reliable, but it is not valid. There are several more elements to reliability and validity of variables, which you will look at in more detail in module 10 when you are understanding reliability and validity. You need to know this so that you select your variables correctly. Now that we have done that, we go to scales of measurement in variables. We need to understand the different levels of variable measurement. You must be clear about these levels of measurement because this decides what statistical analysis can be used for your research, and that in turn will influence the conclusion of your study, especially when you are trying to describe relationship between variables. As you can see on your screen, variables can be divided into two distinct groups, okay? Categorical variables or qualitative variables and continuous or quantitative variables. Okay? Categoric variables are of two types, nominal and ordinal, okay? And continuous variables are of again two types, which are interval and ratio variables. Now, we will discuss each of these. Nominal variables are the most basic level of measurement. They have two or more mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. They can only be classified and counted, that is measured on the basis of the names or labels of the categories. They are non-numeric. They cannot be ranked or ordered. They cannot be compared. Example, all the states of India. So, Himachal Pradesh, Uttaranchal, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra are all states of India. They do not have an intrinsic order. You can use rules to rank them alphabetically in terms of population, area, rainfall, infant mortality, number of seats they have in the parliament. You can rank them, but these are not inherent to the states. You are imposing these rankings on them based on certain other variables. Okay? Similarly, gender is a nominal variable. Male, female and the third gender, these are three categories. You can rank them, you can't compare them. Okay? Next category of variables are ordinal variables. These also have two or more categories, but they can be ranked, and ranks can be used to determine the differences amongst the categories. These are also non-numeric. They measure only how much more one is, one value, how much it is greater or lesser than another value. Okay? Example could be by asking people how often they watch television. So, their responses, and they choose from a series of responses, very often, frequently, sometimes, rarely or never. Okay. So, here you can compare the frequency of responses. Okay. You will know whether someone watches frequently or less. So, you can compare, saying someone who is watching movies frequently and someone who watches movies less often. That is the only comparison you can do. But once again, these are non-numeric. So, you cannot understand and estimate the numerical distance between frequently and sometimes. Okay. Another example would be in terms of degrees of agreement. So, let us say we are asking somebody, do you agree with the Right to Education Act? And somebody may say we completely agree or completely disagree, and there may be a range in between, saying somewhat agree, somewhat disagree or unsure. Okay. Once again, you have the range and you can only compare responses within this range. Okay. So, this is also an ordinal variable. Now, we come to interval variables. Interval variables are measured on a continuum. They have a numeric value. They have equal intervals between the items or the values. Okay. For example, you can take a thermometer, Celsius or Fahrenheit. Okay. Temperature is measured continuously. The difference between 2 degrees is 10. For example, 20 and 30 will be 10. So, it is on a variable and the interval is predetermined. Scores on an IQ test is another example of internal variable. Ratio variables are also measured on a continuum. They also have a numeric value, but they have an absolute 0, which indicates that there is no value of that variable or that property at that level. That means the property is completely absent at that level. So, if we take temperature on a Celsius or Fahrenheit, they will not be a ratio variable because there is no 0, absolute 0 on these. Okay. That does not mean that there is no, because 0 on a centigrade or a Celsius or a Fahrenheit does not mean there is no temperature. Okay, 0 means that is 0 degrees, but does not mean there is no temperature at that point, because you have -5, -10, okay, where it becomes colder. But if you are familiar with science and you know about the Kelvin scale, there is an absolute 0, which actually shows where there is no temperature. Absolute 0 on the Kelvin scale of temperature shows that there is no temperature. So, Kelvin scale can be considered to be a ratio variable. Other comparisons of ratio variable include height and weight, currency, mass, etc., where you can compare two quantities. Okay? You can use the ratio of measurements over there. A research study often uses a variety of combinations of these 4 variables. For example, if you are looking at school dropouts, and you might collect nominal variables in terms of districts where the study is to be conducted, gender of school dropouts. You might collect data as interval variables, grades of children who dropped out, okay, in terms of 90 to 100 marks, 80 to 89. So, you know, scales on those lines. Ratio variables in terms of percentage of children who dropped out in each class. So, you have a multiple method of multiple variables are being used. To conclude, variables are important because they help measure concept in a study. They help you choose the right ways of measuring, because when you have the right variables, you can figure out how to measure and explain these better. Okay. So, we need to identify the variables correctly so that you are measuring what you want to measure. Conceptual definition and operational definition are essential. Variables are measured at different scales. At one end they can be categorized or ranked, and at the other they can be analyzed statistically. Now, just to mention that we normally talk about variables in quantitative research. That is not to say qualitative research never uses variables. Okay. Qualitative research also uses variables such as, but they are not called variables. Qualitative research also uses variables, except they are not always referred to as variables. They look at characteristics on which people or social units differ. You do not use statistical tests, instead you use a conceptual map that shows the relationship between variables as hypothesized by you initially, or as it comes out through the revelations of the respondents of the research. Now, we conclude this topic on variables with a summary. A variable is a characteristic or a quantity of a phenomena that can be measured or classified. Values of variables will change over unit and across time. It is important to quantitative research because research focuses on measuring relationship or explaining relationship between variables. Variables play a key part in the selection of the methods, tools of the study, and thus they influence the results of the study. When choosing the variable, the best way to do so is to do literature review, look at what has been used in similar studies. Okay. When this is not possible, researchers need to pre-test their choice of variables to make sure that the results that you want are being brought out by these variables. It is also advisable to use multiple variables to measure the same concept. Like we mentioned earlier, use different aspects to measure socioeconomic status. Variables are basically of two types, independent and dependent variables. To check accuracy of variables, researchers look at reliability and validity of variables. Scales of measurement of variables include nominal scale, ordinal scale, interval scale and ratio scale. With this, we conclude the session on variables. I hope you learnt a lot of information from this. Thank you.